A while back, we discussed the idea of vulture theory, which is the idea that your best bet in a game, Commander Magic, is to hang back and allow your opponents to fight out amongst themselves, and then after they've run out of resources, you swoop in to pick up the scraps. In other multiplayer games, this is just called third partying, but there's a new emerging strategy in cEDH that sort of flips this idea on its head, and it revolves around one card. And that card is Heartwood Storyteller. So let's examine the multiplayer dynamics of Magic and how Heartwood Storyteller flips this entire idea on its head.
Distraction makers.
Okay, so before we get into talking about Heartwood Storyteller and how it changes the multiplayer dynamics of Commander, we first need to build a framework so we can understand the actual dynamics at the table. This can be seen as a circular framework, the same way that the strategy circle can with Rush economy and defense. But this one I think we'll just refer to as the politics circle for now. And the three positions on the circle are the threat, which most players are probably familiar with, the compliant, which I'll explain a bit more about what that means, and the enforcer. In contrast to the strategy circle, the strategy circle is effectively a framework for you to wrap your head around how you are spending your resources, where the politics circle is how you are perceiving other players or how other players are perceiving you. And so let's start with the one that players are most familiar with, which is the threat. It's the player who is probably in the best position to win the game or perceived to be the player who is most likely to be winning the game. And this dynamic emerges because you might play particularly powerful or splashy cards, and other players might view that as you attempting to gain advantage in the game. There's a lot of nuance to understanding who the threat is, and that might, and this is backed up by your knowledge of what is actually important to winning a game in Magic. And so you'll have a lot of conversations that revolve around who's drawn the most cards, who's ramped the most, who has the biggest board presence, who is seemingly to not have done much, but might have been accruing advantage over time that other players aren't really noticing. When there is a threat at the table, the next sort of player archetype that emerges is what is called the enforcer. And this is the player who is basically stepping up to stop the threat, right? This is the person who is using their resources to stop another player from winning. This sometimes is a selected role, like if you were the only one at the table in a position who has interaction, you might be selected as the enforcer, and maybe you have the most card advantage, and that's fine. The thing to always keep in mind in that dynamic is that you are doing the rest of the table a favor, and so you should use that leverage to sort of get some kind of a deal with the rest of the table. The other thing that can happen is that the systems of Magic can force somebody into the position of being an enforcer. And this happens through what's called priority bullying, which basically means that whichever player is the threat is doing something that will win them the game. The player that would have the turn directly before them, so the player sitting to the right of the threat, that player is in the weakest position because of the way priority passing works in Magic, where the other two players at the table can just pass priority and force that player to sort of jump on the grenade. And finally, we have what I'm calling the compliant. And this is the player who is just being perceived as somebody who is there, not particularly a threat, but also not enforcing. There's somebody who is just playing the game, doing the things that are acceptable by the table, and probably gaining advantage, but nothing that feels out of line with where the rest of the players are at the table. And the most important thing to understand about this particular position is that players are incentivized to convince other players that they are in a compliant position. So the most interesting dynamic of the politics circle is this idea that so much of this is about perception. And this is this is why this operates kind of outside of Magic systems. It's influenced by Magic systems, and it's influenced by the knowledge of the game that each individual player has, which would allow you to convince or be convinced or not be convinced that somebody is a threat or somebody is in compliance. The entirety of gaining advantage in Commander is based on whether or not you can convince the rest of the table that you are in compliance when you are actually a threat. And then on top of that, if there is a threat at the table, you can convince other people that they need to step into the role of enforcer. This framework comes from game theory, basically, where it's kind of about managing the commons, where often these dynamics are referred to as the threat is called the robber, the compliant is called the citizen, and the enforcer is called the guard or the cop. Now that we kind of hopefully have wrapped our heads around the sort of gameplay, politics, dynamics at the table, we can get back to Heartwood Storyteller. Heartwood Storyteller is 2 green and 1 generic mana, is a creature tree folk. It is a 2/3, but most importantly, its ability says whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, each of that player's opponents may draw a card. The way that Heartwood Storyteller creates these dynamics at the table is a little counterintuitive. So Heartwood Storyteller says whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, each of that player's opponents may draw a card, which would make you think that players would not want to play non-creature spells, right? Because they don't want to have their opponents draw cards. The thing to remember is that when one player is attempting to win the game, you often view your other opponents as your allies in that moment. And so the dynamics at the table, instead of forcing one player to be the enforcer against the player who's attempting to win the game as the player who's usually last in priority order, you instead will work together with the other 3 players to draw each other interaction to stop people from winning. This is actually quite similar to Rhystic Study dynamics, where often players who aren't as experienced in cEDH will say something like, well, Rhystic Study's fine, you just pay the 1, and then players don't draw the cards. But often you actually want to draw your opponent's cards because you will draw them into interaction, which will help you turn the game into a stalemate. And Heartwood Storyteller works similar to that, but just imagine it as putting a Rhystic Study into play for basically all other players when it's in play. This is also why players don't really want to remove Heartwood Storyteller, because they're equally benefiting from their opponents drawing the cards and then their opponents playing spells that draw them cards. It does have a chilling effect also on turbo decks, as if they would try to win the game, they will draw their opponents a bunch of cards to interact with the things that they're trying to do. So Heartwood Storyteller is playing a lot of roles in this instance, but also a bit counterintuitive, I suppose. Sam Black actually has a great video on his channel that goes over a deck that he built, a Rug Thras deck that uses Heartwood Storyteller as its engine, effectively. So if you want to go more in detail on the actual deck building side of this, I would make sure to check out that video. It's linked in the description. So once Heartwood Storyteller is in play, it effectively means that when somebody attempts to win the game, there will be enough non-creature spells that are being cast that everybody will probably draw almost their entire library. The way then you would want to build your deck is to win from that position. You want to enable your opponents to be enforcers so that you can then win over the top with inevitability through the enforcement interaction that other players would have at the table. And there's kind of a sweet spot to do this because Heartwood Storyteller removes the card disadvantage part of being an enforcer, but it doesn't remove the mana disadvantage. And most of the counter spells, most of the interaction that is played in cEDH is free or very low mana. And so you are enabling your opponents to use their counter spells to stop their opponents from winning. But they don't then have the mana advantage to continually put win attempts on the stack. This is starting to get a little cEDH heavy, I'm sure, but everybody will have a flash enabler. Everybody will have infinite mana or close to it. Everybody have a ton of interaction. And so you'll just sort of put win attempt after win attempt after win attempt on top of each other to the point where sometimes all of your deck's interaction can be used up or stuck on that stack pile. The way that this Heartwood Storyteller deck attempts to win the game from that position is to discard an Eldrazi, because once the Eldrazi hits your graveyard, you get to shuffle your graveyard back into your deck and effectively reuse your interaction. You are forcing a game state where you have infinite interaction on top of infinite mana, on top of infinite ways to win the game. So I think the reason why Heartwood Storyteller in this situation is so dangerous, I guess, I don't know if that's the right word, but so impactful, is that players are incentivized to keep Heartwood Storyteller in play. Like, they don't want to remove it because you're sort of stuck in this kind of prisoner's dilemma where if you were to remove it, you wouldn't have access to, I guess, teammates that are acting as enforcers against one player that's attempting to win. And so you're stuck in this situation where nobody can win the game, right? You are forcing a stalemate. This pushes games to go really long. They often go to time. This is a logistics problem because tournaments going, like every round going to time makes tournaments last a really long time. And then it also means that in elimination rounds, once you get to sort of that top 16, top 8, you have to put a time limit on those finals rounds in the game to sort of wrap up the tournament so that you don't end up in that scenario that like we had the one time with the 11-hour game. Okay, so that's the situation with Heartwood Storyteller, but let's zoom back out again to the politics circle. I think it's important to understand that this is the core of Commander's gameplay. I think in its best light, it is using the systems of Magic to convince other players of who is the threat at the table. Now, some of that obviously has subterfuge, right? It has this idea that you are attempting to convince other players that you are not the threat when you are. And your ability to do that allows you to succeed at the game, right? You can effectively remain in compliance while convincing the rest of the table that somebody else is the threat, and they need to move to the enforcer role. But I think at its worst, we can see this dynamic start to creep outside of Magic's game systems to the point where you have players who are attempting to sort of use social pressure to convince other players that someone is a threat when they're not even playing the game. The other thing that's strange in the situation is that the idea of compliance is subjective. It does depend on the gameplay of each individual play group. It depends on what's in play at any given time. And being able to identify what it could be seen to the table as compliant is a benefit to you. But I think this leads to the majority of the problems with power level discrepancy in Commander, and the bracket system is attempting to address this stuff, but I'm not sure that it ever actually can, right? There's always going to be, as long as the what is defined as compliant is made up by the players and not just strictly the rules of the game of Magic, there's no third party to export that idea to. And if one player at the table can convince one other player at the table that you are out of compliance, and you're doing so because you're a bub stomper or because your deck is too powerful or whatever it is, the group dynamics start to get really tricky. The mechanism of enforcement starts to become social pressure instead of game enforcement, instead of counterspells, instead of interaction. And I don't want to say that players do this on purpose. I think it's just something that kind of naturally happens. And I think it can happen without you even really knowing that you're doing it. It can be a feeling. It can be, I'm used to this type of gameplay. This other person is entering the group and they're changing the table dynamics, and they're either making me feel like I am now out of compliance when previously I was in compliance, or they are so clearly out of compliance that I must convince the other players at the table that we need to enforce our idea of compliance on those people. I think that Commander gameplay can be at its best when we all have a foundational understanding of what being sort of in compliance means. It doesn't need to be, it's tough because I think that you start to eliminate some of this politics gameplay if everybody has sort of perfect understanding and no subjectivity about what is a threat and what is in compliance, etc. Hopefully that kind of shed some light on why I think Heartwood Storyteller is in the unique position that it's in and how it vastly changes the gameplay dynamics of Commander. And I hope that this gives you, or I hope this is a good framework for everyone to kind of wrap their heads around the way that sort of politicking at the table works and the idea of shifting between these roles at the table, and how you can utilize this to your advantage. Or maybe more importantly, you can understand when other players are doing this, right? You can identify when somebody is trying to shift the focus away from themselves and onto someone else, or when you're sort of being forced into being the player who is spending their interaction. And that puts you in a position to negotiate. You say, okay, well, if I am the one spending these resources, what is there on offer in return? In an ideal situation, Magic would be a game where players could make deals like that with some kind of a currency, or let's say, for just as an example, you could give another player a mana, right? You could give them a treasure token for their use of that interaction. Maybe you can take off some of the burden because you can give them a treasure token of yours that they can then use to cast that interaction. And I think that would create some really interesting gameplay dynamics that Magic systems just really aren't built for. So that's something I'm interested in exploring. So yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you are working on a game of your own, you should join our Discord. We run a once a month public playtest night where we all kind of get together and test our games. That's coming up on this Thursday. It's always the last Thursday of the month. So if you're watching this video sometime in the future, and it might not be this Thursday, but it's always the last Thursday of the month. But yeah, please join the Discord if you're interested. And also make sure you like and subscribe. And thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.